The cold was a thief. It stole the warmth from Clara's threadbare sweater, the feeling from her fingertips, and the hope from the corners of her small, rented house. It crept through the rattling window frames and seeped up from the floorboards, a relentless, invisible tide. In the living room, her 7-year-old son, Leo, coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the house's own decay. The furnace had died 3 days ago, not with a bang, but with a weary sigh, as if it too had finally given up. Clara had wrapped the base of it in old towels, a futile gesture against the finality of its silence. Her phone lay on the chipped formica countertop, a dark, malevolent rectangle. The last conversation with her landlord, Mr. Henderson, played over in her mind, his voice a slick veneer of false sympathy over a core of pure avarice. "Clara, I feel for you, I do," he'd said, the words smooth as oil. "But sentiment doesn't pay the mortgage. The rent is late, and I have a family who wants the property. A family who can afford the upkeep." He didn't mention that the upkeep was his legal responsibility, a fact he conveniently ignored every time she mentioned the leaking roof or the faulty wiring. The eviction notice, tucked under a magnet on the refrigerator, felt colder than the air in the room. It gave her 1 week, for days had already passed. Neighbors on the quiet suburban street watched her decline with a mixture of pity and judgment. They saw the peeling paint on her porch, the old car that sputtered to life each morning, the weary slump of her shoulders as she carried in groceries. Whispers trailed behind her like a shadow. "Such a shame." Mrs. Gable from next door would murmur to another neighbor over her perfectly manicured hedge. "Letting the place go like that. Her poor husband must be turning in his grave." They saw a failure, a woman unable to keep her head above water. They didn't see the double shifts she worked at the diner, the bills she juggled with the precision of a bomb disposal expert, or the fierce, protective love for her son that was the only furnace still burning inside her. Tonight, that fire was dwindling to embers. She looked at Leo, his small face pale in the gloom, and felt a familiar, crushing weight settle in her chest. Humiliation was a constant companion, but tonight, it felt like it was finally winning. The next morning, the confrontation she had been dreading arrived in a gleaming black sedan that was offensively out of place on her cracked driveway. Mr. Henderson emerged, his suit immaculate, his shoes reflecting the gray, unforgiving sky. He didn't bother knocking, rapping his knuckles on the doorframe with an air of ownership that made Clara's stomach clench. He stepped inside without being invited, his gaze sweeping across the room, cataloging every flaw with a smug curl of his lip. "Clara," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "We need to talk about your situation." He gestured vaguely at the blankets piled on the sofa where Leo was huddled, his cough more persistent now. "This is no environment for a child. It's practically squalor." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture she hated but couldn't help. "The furnace is broken, Mr. Henderson. I called you 3 times. He waved a dismissive hand. "An old unit. These things happen. A responsible tenant would have had it serviced." He ignored the fact that the lease explicitly stated major appliance repair was his duty. "Look, I'm not a monster. I'm prepared to offer you a deal." He leaned against the wall, striking a pose he likely thought was magnanimous. "Forgo the last month's rent you owe me, and be out by tomorrow evening. I'll even consider not reporting this delinquency to the credit agencies. It's the best you're going to get." The threat was clear. Take the humiliating offer or face financial ruin on top of homelessness. From across the street, Mrs. Gable paused her gardening, her eyes narrowed with curiosity. Mr. Peterson, 2 doors down, lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold from his porch. They couldn't hear the words, but Henderson's aggressive posture and Clara's shrinking form told a story they were all too ready to believe. The story of a tenant being rightfully disciplined, of a problem finally being dealt with. Their silence was a verdict. In their eyes, she was already gone, a temporary blight on their tidy world, about to be scrubbed away. Henderson saw her hesitation and pressed his advantage. "Tomorrow, Clara, or I'll have the sheriff here myself." Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He turned and walked away, leaving the door open to the biting wind, a final act of contempt. The cold that rushed in felt no different from the cold that was already there. The image of her late husband, Daniel, was what kept Clara from crumbling. It wasn't a faded photograph or a ghost in the corner, but a living memory, as solid and dependable as he had been. She remembered him in the garage of their first, tiny home, the one they'd had to sell after the diagnosis. The air had smelled of sawdust and his quiet determination. He was fixing a wobbly leg on an old chair she'd found on the curb. His hands, broad and calloused from his work in construction and scarred from his time in the service, were surprisingly gentle with the wood. "Anything worth having is worth fixing, Clara," he'd said, not looking up. "People, too. You don't throw something away just because it's broken. You find the strength in it and you build around that." Daniel was a man built of quiet principles. He'd served 2 tours overseas, not because he loved conflict, but because he believed in standing between the vulnerable and the cruel. He came back with a limp he never complained about and a deep-seated belief in dignity. "Respect isn't something you demand," he'd told her once, after a foreman had tried to short his crew on their pay. "It's something you earn by showing it to others, especially when they have nothing to give you back." He had faced down the foreman, not with threats, but with an unshakable calm that was far more intimidating. The crew got their money. After he passed, the medical bills had devoured their savings like a plague of locusts. Clara was left with Leo, a mountain of debt, and Daniel's code of honor. It was a poor inheritance in a world that valued Henderson's brand of predatory success, but it was the only thing she refused to sell. She saw Daniel's integrity in Leo's honest eyes and felt his resilience in her own tired bones. When she looked at the eviction notice, she didn't just see a threat to her home. She saw a betrayal of everything Daniel had stood for. Giving up, letting Henderson bully her into the street, would be like letting him die all over again. So she held on, fueled by a strength she didn't know she had. A strength forged in love and loss. It was a quiet, stubborn fire that the world saw as weakness, but Daniel would have recognized it for what it was, the very definition of strength. The pressure mounted with the setting sun. The temperature plummeted, and the gray sky thickened, promising a storm. The house grew darker, colder. Clara boiled pots of water on the stove, letting the steam add a meager, temporary humidity to the air. She dressed Leo in 3 layers of clothing, his small body lost in the bulk. His cough was now a constant, painful punctuation to the house's groaning silence. He was shivering, even under a mountain of blankets. Fear, sharp and acidic, rose in Clara's throat. She had called every shelter in a 50-mile radius. All were full. "The storm's bringing everyone in," a tired voice had told her. "Call back in a few days, a few days." She had until tomorrow. She sat with Leo, reading him a story about a brave knight, her voice trembling slightly. The words felt hollow. What good were tales of courage when she felt so utterly powerless? Through the front window, she could see the warm, yellow squares of her neighbors' houses. Lights twinkled on Christmas trees that had been put up early. She could imagine the families inside, gathered around their roaring fires and functioning furnaces, insulated from the cold and from her. Not a single person had crossed the street. No one had knocked on her door to ask if she was okay. They had seen Henderson's car. They had seen her standing on the porch, defeated. Their drawn curtains were a wall, their silence a judgment. She was on an island of cold and despair, and the rest of the world was content to let her sink. The weight of her isolation was suffocating. Every creak of the house sounded like a final death rattle. She thought about packing, about where they could possibly go. The car? A motel for a night or 2 until her last few dollars ran out. The scenarios played out in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. She held Leo tighter, his small head resting against her chest. His shivering was a frantic vibration that traveled straight to her heart. This was it. This was the breaking point Daniel had talked about, the moment you discover what you're really made of. Right now, she felt like she was made of glass, about to shatter into a million pieces. The first flakes of snow began to fall, thick and wet, clinging to the window pane like icy tears. The storm hit with a fury that felt personal, a physical manifestation of the world's indifference. Wind howled like a hungry wolf around the corners of the house, and snow began to pile in thick, suffocating drifts. It was well past midnight when a sound, distinct from the storm's chaos, pierced the gloom. It was a sputtering, mechanical roar, followed by a violent clang of metal on pavement, and then silence. Curiosity, or perhaps a primal instinct to investigate any disruption, pulled Clara to the window. Peering through a patch she'd wiped clear of condensation, she saw it. A motorcycle, a huge, hulking machine, half buried in a snowdrift at the end of her driveway. And beside it, a figure was trying to stand, stumbling before collapsing into the snow. For a moment, she froze. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to lock the door, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. A stranger, a biker, in the middle of the night. It was a risk she couldn't afford. But then she saw the figure try to push himself up again, his movements slow, agonizing. He was losing. The storm was winning. Daniel's voice echoed in her mind. You don't throw something away just because it's broken. This man wasn't just broken. He was freezing to death on her doorstep. Her problems, the eviction, the cold, the crushing loneliness, suddenly seemed secondary to the immediate, life-or-death drama unfolding in the blizzard. With a resolve that surprised even herself, she pulled on her worn boots and thin coat. The wind tore the door from her hand and slammed it against the house. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. She waded through the knee-deep snow, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The man was huge, a mountain of leather and denim, now covered in a shroud of white. His face was ashen, his beard crusted with ice. He was barely conscious. "Hey!" she yelled over the wind. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, a flicker of confusion in their depths. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. "Bike? Engine seized." Clara didn't hesitate. "Forget the bike. You'll die out here." She grabbed one of his arms, trying to pull him up. It was like trying to move a boulder. He was a dead weight. "You have to help me," she grunted, her voice strained. Try to stand, summoning a last reserve of strength. He managed to get his legs under him. Leaning heavily on her, they began the torturous journey back to the house. It was a clumsy, desperate shuffle, two broken people holding each other up against the storm. She got him inside, collapsing with him onto the floor just inside the doorway, the snow melting in pools around them. She had invited the storm itself into her home, a huge, dangerous stranger. But as she looked at his face, the humanity beneath the ice and leather, she knew she hadn't had a choice. She had nothing left to give, so she had given the only thing she had: sanctuary. The first light of dawn revealed a world transformed, buried under a pristine blanket of white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. Inside Clara's house, the stranger was asleep on the floor, wrapped in every spare blanket she owned. His leather jacket, stiff with ice, was draped over a chair near the stove, dripping onto a towel. His breathing was deep and even, the threatening rattle gone. Clara had stayed up most of the night, watching him, watching Leo, her fear slowly subsiding into a state of surreal exhaustion. She had made coffee, the aroma a small, defiant luxury in the cold air. The biker stirred, groaning as he sat up. He was even larger than she'd realized, his shoulders filling the space. He looked around the sparse room, his eyes taking in the peeling paint, the threadbare furniture, the eviction notice on the fridge. Clara braced herself for a comment, a sneer, a look of pity. But his gaze, when it met hers, held only a quiet, assessing respect. "You saved my life last night," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Anyone would have done the same," she said, handing him a mug of coffee. He took it, his large, tattooed hands wrapping around the warmth. "No," he said, looking her straight in the eye. They wouldn't have. He took a sip, his gaze drifting to Leo, who was still asleep on the sofa. That your boy? He's got a bad cough. The furnace is broken, Clara said simply, without a trace of self-pity. The man nodded slowly, a universe of understanding in the simple gesture. He didn't offer platitudes or empty promises. He just sat there, drinking her coffee, a silent, formidable presence in her crumbling home. After a while, he stood, his massive frame seeming to shrink the room. I need to go. Need to make a call. He walked to the door and put on his now-dry jacket. He paused, his hand on the knob. My name is Grizz, he said. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash. He peeled off several $100 bills and held them out to her. Clara looked at the money, then back at his face. It was more cash than she had seen in years. It was the answer to a dozen prayers. It was a way out, and she shook her head. No, she said, her voice soft but firm. I didn't do it for money. Grizz looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly, deliberately put the money back in his pocket. He gave a single, sharp nod. Respect, he rumbled. And then he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of leather and the indentation on her floor. As he walked down the driveway, Mrs. Gable's curtains twitched violently. Mr. Peterson, shoveling his walk, stopped and stared, his mouth slightly agape. A biker, leaving that house at dawn. The neighborhood's silent judgment had found a new, scandalous focus. They thought they knew the story, but they hadn't even read the first page. It began as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Clara was trying to coax a little more warmth from the stove when she first noticed it. She thought it was a snowplow, or perhaps the town's ancient sanitation truck. But the sound didn't fade. It grew, deepening from a rumble to a growl, then to a thunderous, ground-shaking roar. It was the sound of an approaching army. Leo woke up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. What's that noise, Mommy? Clara went to the window. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Cresting the hill at the end of her street was a wave of steel and chrome. Motorcycles. Dozens of them, then 50, then 100. They moved with the disciplined precision of a cavalry charge, their headlights cutting through the bright morning air. They were huge, gleaming Harleys, ridden by men who seemed carved from the same granite as their machines. They wore leather vests or cuts, adorned with patches, skulls, eagles, and the same two words emblazoned on Grizz's back, Hell's Angels. The column of bikers turned onto her street. The roar was deafening now, echoing off the quiet houses. Neighbors, drawn by the incredible noise, appeared on their porches and in their windows, their faces a mask of disbelief and terror. Mrs. Gable dropped her trowel. Mr. Peterson froze mid-shovel, his jaw slack. This wasn't a scandal. This was an invasion. The bikers didn't slow down. They filled the street from curb to curb, a river of black leather and polished metal. Then, as one, they began to pull over, parking in a staggered, perfect formation in front of Clara's little house. One by one, the engines were cut, the thunderous roar replaced by a series of sharp, metallic pops and clicks, until an unnerving silence fell over the street. Over 120 bikers now stood on her lawn, on her sidewalk, filling the entire road. They were a wall of intimidation, their faces grim and unsmiling. They didn't speak. They just stood there, their collective gaze fixed on her front door. They had formed a perimeter, a fortress of leather and steel around her broken-down house. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched Leo's hand, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this a threat? Retaliation? She had sheltered their leader, and now his army was on her doorstep. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken menace. Then, from the back of the crowd, a path cleared. Grizz walked through it, his face as serious as before. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her, his expression unreadable. The entire street held its breath. Just as Grizz reached the bottom of her steps, Mr. Henderson's black sedan turned onto the street, nosing its way arrogantly through the narrow gap the bikers had left. He was early. He had come to ensure she was packing, to gloat over his victory. He slammed his car door, his face a mask of irritation. "What in God's name is all this?" he snapped, striding toward the house. "This is a private street. You people need to move these things." He gestured dismissively at the rows of immaculate motorcycles. He didn't see an army. He saw a nuisance, a pack of vagrants cluttering his view. He pushed past a biker who was built like a refrigerator, heading straight for Clara's porch. "Clara, I told you tomorrow," he barked. "Is this your idea of a joke? Did you call your degenerate friends to try and intimidate me?" Grizz turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Henderson. He didn't say a word. He simply raised a hand. The biker Henderson had pushed took one step forward, blocking his path. Henderson puffed out his chest. "Get out of my way. This is my property." The biker didn't flinch. He just stared down at the smaller man, his silence more threatening than any shout. Grizz finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an authority that cut through the tension. He wasn't speaking to Henderson. He was speaking to his men, but his words were for everyone to hear. "Last night, a storm hit," he began, his voice rumbling across the silent street. "My bike went down. I was freezing to death. Right there," he pointed a thick finger at the spot where Clara had found him. "No one stopped. Doors stayed locked. Curtains were drawn." His gaze swept over the neighbors' houses, a silent accusation. "Then this woman," he continued, turning his eyes back to Clara. "This woman who has nothing. She opened her door. Her house is freezing. Her kid is sick. She's getting thrown out on the street by this piece of garbage." He jerked his head toward Henderson, who had gone pale. "She had every reason in the world to leave me in that snowbank. But she didn't. She dragged my half-frozen carcass inside, gave me her last blankets, and her last coffee." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She asked for nothing in return. She refused my money. She did it because it was the right thing to do." He looked from Clara to his men, his voice dropping lower, filled with a raw, fierce emotion. "She showed this club what honor looks like. She showed me what honor looks like." The truth of it settled over the street, a stunning, undeniable revelation. This wasn't an invasion. It was a pilgrimage. This wasn't a threat. It was an honor guard. Henderson, realizing his profound miscalculation, began to stammer. "Now, hold on. This is a simple landlord-tenant dispute. There's no need for all this." Grizz finally turned his full attention to him. His eyes were like chips of ice. "You put your hands on her or her boy, you try to throw her out. You even look at this house the wrong way again," Grizz said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "And you'll have to deal with every single one of us. This is our house now. She is our family now. Are we clear?" Henderson, his face the color of ash, could only manage a terrified, jerky nod. A huge biker standing beside him, a man with a tattoo of a wrench on his neck, stepped forward. "I heard you got a furnace problem, ma'am," he said to Clara, his voice surprisingly gentle. Another biker, wiry and older, pointed at the roof. "That leak looks pretty bad. We got a guy for that." A switch had been flipped. The static, intimidating wall of men broke apart into a flurry of purposeful action. They weren't just protectors. They were builders. The biker with the wrench tattoo, whose name was Socket, headed for the basement with two others, tool bags appearing as if from nowhere. The wiry biker, Deacon, directed a team of 4 men to a truck that had parked at the end of the line. They pulled out ladders, shingles, and tarps. Within minutes, half a dozen men were on Clara's roof, their hammers echoing in a steady, productive rhythm that was the polar opposite of the morning's threatening silence. Another group of bikers, led by a man with a neatly trimmed beard and chef's pants under his leathers, unloaded boxes and bags from the saddlebags of their bikes. Groceries, bags of them. They formed a line, passing them up to the porch. Fresh bread, milk, eggs, vegetables, meat. Enough food to last for months. The community watched, utterly stunned. This wasn't the chaotic violence they associated with motorcycle gangs from movies. This was a coordinated, efficient, and overwhelming act of generosity. Mr. Peterson stood on his lawn, his shovel forgotten, his mouth hanging open. Mrs. Gable came out onto her porch, clutching her robe, her eyes wide with disbelief. Henderson, meanwhile, was being quietly and firmly escorted back to his car by two of the largest bikers Clara had ever seen. They didn't lay a hand on him, but their presence was so immense, so absolute, that he seemed to shrink, scurrying into his driver's seat like a frightened rodent. He fumbled with his keys, started the engine, and sped away without a backward glance. Grizz watched him go, then turned back to Clara. "We don't forget," he said simply. "Kindness like that, it's a debt. We always pay our debts." He walked up the steps and stood before her. He was holding a small, folded leather vest. It was a child's size, brand new, with a single patch sewn over the heart, a roaring grizzly bear, and the words, "Protected Property." He knelt down in front of Leo, who had been watching the whole spectacle with wide, unafraid eyes. "This is for you, little man," Grizz said, his voice softening. "So everyone knows you're with us." He helped Leo put on the vest. It was a perfect fit. The boy puffed out his chest, a small, proud soldier in a new army. Then Grizz stood and handed Clara a patch identical to the one on Leo's vest. "This is for the house," he said. "Put it somewhere everyone can see it. No one will ever bother you again." It was more than a gift. It was a sigil of protection, a declaration of allegiance. Recognition, powerful and absolute, had arrived not in the form of a neighbor's nod, but in the roar of 100 engines and the unwavering loyalty of a brotherhood she never knew existed. By late afternoon, the house was transformed. The rhythmic thud of hammers from the roof had ceased, replaced by the secure look of new shingles that gleamed in the setting sun. Down in the basement, a low, powerful hum announced the birth of a new furnace, its steady heat already pushing back the years of accumulated cold. The air inside, for the first time in forever, felt warm and safe. The scent of roasting chicken, prepared by the biker chef named Padre, filled the small space, mingling with the smell of fresh lumber and clean wiring. A biker who was a master electrician had gone through the entire house, replacing frayed cords and faulty outlets, his quiet work banishing the flickering lights that had been a constant, nagging worry. The kitchen was full, the pantry stocked, the refrigerator humming and packed with food. The bikers worked with a joyful efficiency, their gruff camaraderie a symphony of grunted instructions and shared laughter. They were a tribe, a family, and for one day they had opened their circle to include her. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-covered street in shades of orange and pink, the work was done. The tools were packed away, the debris was cleared, and the house stood not as a symbol of decay, but as a monument to unexpected grace. The neighbors, who had started the day in fear and ended it in awe, began to emerge. Mrs. Gable, her face etched with a shame that was deeper than her earlier judgment, walked across her lawn holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. She offered them to Deacon, the wiry biker from the roof. He took one with a nod. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his smile genuine. Mr. Peterson appeared with a thermos of hot cider, pouring it into paper cups for the men. The wall of silence and judgment had crumbled, replaced by a bridge of tentative, humbled respect. Grizz stood with Clara on her new, sturdy porch. Leo, refusing to take off his vest, leaned against the biker's leg, playing with a polished chrome nut a biker named Chrome had given him. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. The words felt impossibly small, inadequate for the scale of the miracle that had unfolded on her street. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Grizz looked down at her, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You already did, Clara," he said. "You reminded us what we're about. It ain't about the noise or the leather. It's about this." He gestured to the warm light spilling from her windows, to the gathered men, to the quiet respect on the street. "It's about loyalty. You showed us loyalty when you had nothing to gain from it. That makes you family." He placed a hand on Leo's head. "You raise him right. Raise him to be like his mom. One by one, the bikers started their engines. The roar returned, but this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a chorus. It was a promise. It was a salute. They pulled out in the same disciplined formation, a wave of red taillights receding into the twilight. Grizz was the last to leave. He swung a leg over his bike, its engine a low, contented purr. He looked at Clara one last time, gave her a slow, deliberate nod of profound respect, and then he was gone, joining the river of his brothers. The street fell silent again, but it was a different silence. It was a silence of peace, of security. Clara stood on her porch, holding the patch he had given her, the leather cool and solid in her hand. She looked at her home, warm and whole. She looked at her son, safe and proud in his new vest. The cold was gone, banished not just from the house, but from her soul. A quiet dignity had settled over the small house on the quiet street, a dignity forged in kindness, and now, forever protected by the thunder of 100 angels.